This trail provides an introduction to the history of selected parts of Olney's wide High Street. The wide High Street stretching from the marketplace in the south to the Knoll in the north is arguably the major feature that makes Olney so attractive and a very desirable place to live. The width is complemented by the various styles of attractive houses, intermingled with small stone cottages and traditional business premises. There are many features and stories that are contenders for inclusion in an Olney High Street trail. We have selected 8 to indicate the diversity available. Others could be included at a later date. This trail has been developed and edited for digital media by the Olney District Historical Society. Completion of this trail takes between 35 and 50 minutes.
The wide High Street. The start point for the first point of interest on this trail is the marketplace on the pavement outside the Cherry Tree restaurant, formerly known as Westlands. This position, see the recent image, provides a good general view of the wide High Street. The next image is a photograph of the High Street taken around 1900 and includes this start point. A few centuries ago the width of the High Street comprised 3 elements. The most significant element was the stream that flowed down the west side of the High Street. Its dilapidated banks were propped up with wickerwork and had overhanging willow trees. The stream emerged from Spout Lane, now called Spring Lane, and ran in a northerly direction along the High Street until it met another stream flowing in the opposite direction. They met at a point called the High Arch, broadly sited near the United Reformed Church, halfway down the street. Where they joined, the stream then flowed eastwards across the meadow to the River Ouse. Incidentally, Mr. Garrett, a solicitor, was the last person to hold the duck shooting rights for the High Street. The second element was the raised wide-pitched causeway that ran down the center of the High Street, where pedestrians could walk dry-shod when the stream was in flood. The causeway extended from the junction with Spring Lane for around half a mile to approximately the junction with Midland Road. The causeway was removed in 1790. The third element was the track for wheeled traffic sited on the east side of the High Street. Together these elements demanded the wide High Street as seen today. 2 colored photographs taken around 1900 of the High Street, covering its middle section and also its northern end, are also included. To proceed to the next point of interest, the 2 Brewers Inn, please use the controlled crossing to cross the main road. Then take a gentle stroll along the pavement on the east side of the High Street for 250 meters or so. During this stroll please take note of the variety of building styles and especially their roof lines.
The 2 Brewers Inn, the second point of interest. The first image is a photograph of the 2 Brewers Inn in 1953, decorated for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. The 2 Brewers Inn has spent most of its life as 2 separate properties. A closer look at the ground floor reveals an archway between the 2 entrances at the front of the building. The center of the arch now houses the bar area. Before the early 1950s the larger property on the north side accommodated both the Mechanics' Institute and the Conservative Club. The smaller building on the south side was the 2 Brewers Inn, formerly the Queen's Head. In earlier times the archway between them was the primary route for the fire engine to reach the High Street from the fire station situated at the rear of the property. After the siren had sounded, summoning the firemen to the station, it must have been exciting to watch the fire engine, with its bell frantically ringing, emerge from the narrow archway into the High Street. The next image is a photograph taken around 1930 of the Olney fire engine. During the Second World War on the night of 28 October 1940, a German bomber dropped a large bomb in the meadow on the Clifton Rains side of the River Ouse adjacent to the railway line. It was intended for the railway bridge which it missed by a couple of 100 meters. However, the resulting blast was so severe that, having progressed towards Olney and up the rear yard of the 2 Brewers Inn, it funneled through the archway and completely blew out 2 large windows of the shop on the other side of the High Street, then called Linko Stores, now Stephen Oakley Estate Agents. The image shows a 1930s photograph of the shop windows of the Linko Stores. This bombing incident is confirmed by Bucks County Council's Bombs Over Bucks website, which reports that 69 properties were damaged that night in Olney and Clifton Rains. In the 1950s, when the Two Brewers Inn took in the whole building, it developed into a very popular pub under the tenancy of Bob and Ida Ford. A photograph is included of the wheelbarrow race ran on Queen Elizabeth's Coronation Day, as part of Olney's festivities. When Bob and Ida retired in the 1970s, Jack Druce acquired the tenancy. Again the pub prospered and continued to be the most popular pub in town. Jack retired in the 1990s. Nevertheless, the business has continued to be successful to the present day. Incidentally, according to Olney Devil lore, the last appearance of the devil in Olney was at the Two Brewers Inn. Continue walking another 100 meters along the street to the lace factory, the next point of interest.
The lace factory, the third point of interest. The first image is a recent photograph of the building. This site in the high street became available in 1924 as the buildings had been destroyed by fire. So Harry Armstrong, a local lace dealer, purchased the site and, in 1928, employed local builder, George Knight, to erect the lace factory, as it became known. Harry wanted a building the like of which Olney has not seen before. Builder George had to talk him out of Corinthian columns and other fanciful designs. Being the time of the Great Depression, the building was constructed mostly with second-hand materials. The only work with new materials was the carving on the facade, which originally included 3 huge carvings over the front door of a bobbin winder, candle stool and a bobbin stand. Another photograph is of the topping out ceremony on the factory building, unlikely to meet today's health and safety requirements. Lace was never made in the lace factory. It was used as offices and as a warehouse, where lace was sewn onto garments or any article that Harry thought could be adorned with lace. It was then packed into parcels which were sent out worldwide. The next photograph is of the finished building, complete with the carving on the facade, whilst the following photograph taken in July 1931 is of the girls employed at the factory. The lace was made by women in their homes and brought into the lace factory for sale or collected by agents in local villages. Out of their earnings, the lace makers had to buy the thread for the next week's work. Harry advertised his business in women's magazines and by sending out postcards touting for business from individual women or women's groups. A response would result in the dispatch of a parcel of lace on approval. Prospective purchasers were given a month to pay up or return the goods. The late Sis Elderton, who worked in the office for him, said they lost very few parcels. People were honest in those days, she said. Harry was quite a character as he traded as Mrs. Armstrong, believing women were more likely to buy lace from another woman. Sadly, he died at the early age of 56 while on a business trip to Scotland in 1943. Thereafter lace making in Olney, as a business, was only carried on by a few older women who made lace for gifts. A photograph is included of a lace pattern together with another of the finished lace collar, to illustrate a typical example of lace that could have been processed in the lace factory. The lace maker in the final photograph is of Mrs. Mary Wooding, taken around 1930. She could have been categorized as a typical Olney lace maker. Lace making enjoyed a revival in Olney in the 1970s, but by this time the once traditional cottage industry had become a leisure time craft. Continue walking to the next point of interest by walking some 200 meters further along the high street until you arrive at the zebra crossing. Immediately after this crossing, remaining on the east side of the high street, you will arrive at John Lord's malting, the fourth point of interest.
John Lord's malting, the fourth point of interest. The image is a recent photograph of the malting building. John Lord is generally acknowledged to have developed the first extensive brewing business in Olney. John was presumed born in Weston Underwood, but his date of birth is unknown. Records can support that some lords lived in Weston Underwood in the mid-18th century. In William Cooper's time, Samuel Teaden, a friend of the poet and a teacher in Olney, wrote in his diary, whilst at Weston, Mrs. Lord brought Cooper some roast beef down from the farm. John, his family and close relatives owned some 7 public houses, including the Boot, the Sun, and the Duke William. See the recent photographs. This malting at 104 High Street was the only one, of 5, not attached to a public house. It is possible that the Lord family transferred its malting business to these premises in the High Street after they left the Boot Inn around 1840. An old beam-in building has the date the 1st August 1835 carved into it, with the two carpenters' names. John Lord appears to have been an ambitious brewster. Unfortunately, following his death in 1812, his brewery operations appeared to become fragmented amongst his family. Had the business continued under John, it is possible that it would have expanded further, and as a consequence, it probably would not have been viable for Hipwells to develop their brewery interests in Olney at that time. Further details on John Lord's brewery activities, as told by a descendant, another, John Lord, is to be found on the ODHS website. Continue to the Knoll, the 5th point of interest, by crossing the road with care using the zebra crossing. Then walk some 200 meters in a northerly direction on the west side of the High Street until you reach number 133 High Street, Town Farm. This position provides an excellent vantage point for the Knoll.
The Knoll, the 5th point of interest. You should be standing on the pavement outside number 133 High Street. See recent image. Past local historians have suggested that in the northerly direction well beyond the Knoll, a castle, or a monastery, once stood on the east side of Yardley Road. In addition, with a little more certainty, before the parish church was rebuilt in its current position in the 14th century, a church once stood not too far behind the Knoll. Evidence in the form of human remains were found when digging out the footings for the Fioffi cottages in Dartmouth Road. Also, until the 1950s there was an elm tree, known as the churchyard elm, located opposite the Queen Hotel. See second image. These suggest that this northern end was perhaps at one time the most important part of town. There are no records to indicate why the church moved to its current location, although many theories abound. Moving along the timeline, say to a couple of centuries ago, the northern end of Olney, with the exception of a handful of properties, ended at the Knoll. Beyond the Knoll today is the development that emerged after the coming of the railway in 1872. The building of the new streets was intended to accommodate the number of workers that would use the railway to work outside the town, probably in Northampton or Bedford. The third image is a photograph of Olney Station taken in 1911. In reality most, particularly office workers, used buses as the frequency of the trains was insufficient for their needs. As it happened, most properties were let, initially at least, to shoe industry workers, as the majority had workshops, even many factories, built at their rear. These were used by the tenants, working as outworkers, to service the larger factories in the town. In the 20th century, on the north side of the Knoll, stood two buildings. See the fourth image, a photograph taken in 1910. The building on the left was the Castle Inn, a very popular inn after World War II and managed by Auntie and Uncle Fred Lyon. It was the only pub in town that was not owned by brewers Hipwells, and later Phipps, a Wellingborough brewery. The castle was owned by the Northampton Brewery Company. The building on the right was a blacksmith's workshop which continued shoeing horses well into the 1950s. The last blacksmith was Alistair Bull, who lived over the shop. The Castle Inn was substantially extended into its current form after the demise and demolition of the smithy. The premises have recently been fitted out as the Maya Indian Restaurant. The next image, a colored photograph, was taken of the Knoll around 1900. Observe the lighter colored track that crosses the road, just in front of the cyclist and lamp post. There were two such tracks across the High Street, one at each end, which were apparently kept clean so that the ladies did not soil the hems of their clothing with mud, or even worse. The photograph of Olney's Silver Band, see the sixth image, was taken by George Lett in 1899. The band was preparing to play on the Knoll, obviously on a Sunday, as everyone was turned out in their Sunday best clothes. The Knoll was not surfaced at that time, incidentally neither was the marketplace, and it is common knowledge that the surface was far from flat owing to children scraping holes in it on a regular basis to play marbles. The next image is a photograph of the Knoll circa 1948. This image shows no significant structural or environmental changes over the 50 years since 1899. Except, the Knoll itself has been converted into a garden. But who would have thought that after another 50 years, the A509 road, now nominated a UK trunk route, would completely shatter the peaceful nature of this part of town, with numerous very heavy vehicles travelling to Milton Keynes and the M1 motorway. Continue the trail by walking 200 meters towards the marketplace until you arrive at Cobb's Gardens, the sixth point of interest.
The sixth point of interest, Cobb's Gardens. The cottages were accessed through the archway. The first image is a recent photograph. It was one of the best-known courts of tenement buildings in the town, comprising some 10 or more small cottages, often housing large families. The gardens were situated outside their front doors. The second photograph was taken around the 1920s from inside Cobb's Gardens, looking east towards the archway in the High Street. The cottages were demolished in the 1960s and have since been replaced by the NHS Cobb's Garden Surgery. To the left of the archway is Sandwich Land, a former bakery, which once belonged to Freddie Richardson and then Alf Harrison. The bakehouse at its rear could be accessed by walking through the archway and then immediately turning left. On Sunday mornings in the 1930s and 1940s, when Freddie Richardson owned the bakery, housewives, who had neither gas nor electric cookers with which to cook their Sunday roasts and Yorkshire puddings, walked their assembled roasting tins covered with tea towels through the archway to the bakery oven. This baker took in some 50 to 70 roasting tins every Sunday morning, which were collected from 12 o'clock onwards for a charge of about 1p. Continue walking to the seventh point of interest by walking some 70 meters towards the marketplace to number 79 High Street, the light-colored building set back a little from the pavement. This property originally was built as a hall called the New Hall but was later converted into a cinema called the Electric Cinema Olney.
The New Hall, later the Electric Cinema Olney, the seventh point of interest. The first image is a recent photograph of the building. The following text is extracted from a letter written in the early 1990s by the late Percy Wright of Olney. Mr. Lewis Thompson was an Olney grocer trading at 9 High Street in the early 20th century. He had a hall built to be used for concerts, meetings and dancing, and having a stage, the hall became very popular. Often at election meetings it could get a little rowdy, with opposing supporters almost coming to blows. The building was called the New Hall and it was used by the townspeople for many years. The second and third images are photographs of a senior citizens' dinner and a showman's company dinner respectively held in the hall. The dates are unknown. Some years later, in 1919, the hall was bought by Mr. Clifford, who converted the front of the building to form a cinema. The front of the building stood a few meters back from the pavement with 2 steps leading up to the 2 front doors. Inside was a vestibule with a ticket office on the right-hand side. The projection room was built over the front porch, with an outside staircase leading up to it. The first proprietor was Mr. Clifford. His wife was known as Madam Clifford. The fourth image is a photograph showing the front of the cinema. The film being shown at the time was the 1927 King of Kings, a silent film directed by Cecil B. DeMille, an iconic film of its day. The seats installed near the screen were more like forms. Behind them came the wooden single tip-up seats and then a few rows with padded seats. The seats at the rear, just inside the left-hand side of the hall, were plush padded with armrests, and the floor for these had been made a little higher so that people could look over the heads of those in front. In the early days, since there was no sound to accompany the film, when a performance was ready to begin, Madam Clifford walked, much like a duchess, down to the piano. When she was sitting comfortably on the piano stool, the cinema was plunged into darkness and the projectionist, Mr. Chapman, started the performance by turning a handle to feed the film through the projector. As the story unfolded, Madam Clifford would play very softly and slowly for a sad scene, and fast and loud for galloping horses or cowboys and Indians fighting. The fifth image is a well-published postcard of young customers taken outside the cinema around 1920. In the cinema's later years, when silent films were long gone, Mr. Webster became the proprietor and Alistair Ball the projectionist. The cinema closed in the early 1950s. Continue to the eighth point of interest, number 9 High Street.
The eighth and final point of interest, number 9 High Street. The first image is a recent photograph of this property. It is listed as an 18th century building, which has probably spent most of its life as a successful grocery store. The 1891 census records Thomas T. Coles living at number 9, as a grocer and wine merchant, with his wife and family. As both Thomas's father, Benjamin Coles, and grandfather, Daniel Coles were Olney grocers. It is conceivable that number 9 had been in the family for some years. The second image is a portrait of Thomas T. Coles. The 1910 Revenue Survey indicates that, although Thomas T. Coles still owned the property, he had moved into Springfield House. See the third image, a rather large property in Yardley Road. This building is now known as Broomfield and is a residential home. Lewis Thompson ran the business at this time as a provision merchant. The 1910 survey also shows that Lewis Thompson owned some 22 houses and cottages in the town. This was the same previously mentioned Mr. Thompson, who had a new hall built for concerts, meetings and dancing, later to become Olney's Cinema. Mr. Thompson retired to Ivy Cottage, a large house in Midland Road. The shop was later managed by National Grocers International Stores for some years until the rapid growth of supermarkets in the 1960s. This store, together with the Co-op store across the road, numbers 16 and 18 High Street, were arguably the two most successful grocers in the town during the 1940s and 50s. The fourth image is a photograph of the staff who worked at the Inters, as it was known locally in the 1950s. In the 1980s the shop was leased to building societies, including the Woolwich Bank, for some 25 years or so, whilst the remainder of the building was given over to offices and healthcare facilities. Continue walking towards the marketplace for a few meters so that the entrance to Spring Lane is clearly visible. Spring Lane was extremely narrow before number 3 High Street was demolished and Spring Lane was widened in the 1950s. It was just about wide enough for the passage of one horse and cart. The width can be vaguely identified from the fifth image, which is a photograph of Spring Lane and Westlands, now the Cherry Tree, taken around 1910. You will observe that Spring Lane is not exactly wide now, and you will remember that, as its name implies, it had a significant stream flowing down it, before the stream entered the High Street. Now there's a thought to conjure with. So we are almost back where we started, and at the end of this trail. Further information and reading on the points of interest in this trail, and on many other aspects of Olney's history, can be found on Olney District Historical Society's extensive website. On behalf of the Olney District Historical Society and the Cooper and Newton Museum, we trust that you have enjoyed your self-guided trail around Olney High Street. If you did not have an opportunity to visit the Cooper and Newton Museum before starting this walk, then please consider a visit to this amazing heritage attraction in Olney today, or in the near future. And finally, you may have noticed that this trail has conveniently ended within a few steps of a dozen or more restaurants and coffee shops. So before leaving for home, why not make your selection and enjoy?